Hello, everyone, in person and online. Welcome to our panel about feminist and responsible design with Dr. Brianna Wiens and Daniel Harley. Before we start the event, I just want to give you some context about the Games Institute. For those of you who don't know, we're a research institute at the University of Waterloo that's home to interdisciplinary researchers who seek to advance the study, design, and purpose of interactive and immersive technologies. Our research includes, of course, games, but also all sorts of interactive and immersive media at large. And we endeavor to be a place where people from all backgrounds can come and work together and learn from each other beyond the boundaries of discipline. So it's important for us at the Games Institute to acknowledge and recognize the enduring presence and deep traditional knowledge, laws, and philosophies of the Indigenous people with whom we share the land that we live and work on today. We're working to continually make space for Indigenous scholars, designers, commentators, and creators, and to uplift all voices that are marginalized both in academic and gaming communities. We acknowledge that the land on which we work and live today is the traditional land of the Attawaddaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee people. And the University of Waterloo, where we work, is situated on the Haldimand Track, which includes 10 kilometers on either side of the Grand River. Our ability to be working and living here today in the Waterloo region is a direct benefit of policies of exclusion and expulsion of Indigenous people during the time of settlement and Confederation and since then. And so we have responsibilities as beneficiaries to acknowledge and understand the history and the current experiences of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people, and for this understanding to inform the work that we do, so we can stop perpetuating the damages of colonization and begin to repair them. So land acknowledgements like this are just one first step in doing that work. And so if you want to learn more about the Games Institute or our commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion, please check out the information on our website. And so from there, I'm going to hand it over to Bree and Daniel, who are going to talk to you about their research for the rest of this hour. Thank you.
Great.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to people who are online as well. So my portion of the presentation, I'm going to be talking about what I'm calling a question of space towards responsible narrative design questions for virtual reality. Welcome.
I think we should come in, right?
Yeah, you should come in. So I'm an assistant professor at the Stratford School of Interaction Design and Business. My research covers things like virtual reality, storytelling, and all the sort of related aspects of that. I'll just dive right in, but people can come in. So this talk will present a reflection that draws on some of my research into designing VR narratives. I'll be looking back on 4 collaborative projects that I led from 2017 to 2021 to ask how we might interrogate and ultimately extend the conceptual boundaries of the design space of VR narratives. So these were all papers that were published in the field of human-computer interaction, or HCI, and that setting will help inform the context for this talk and some of the questions that I'm going to raise. So I'm basically going to argue that attempts to expand the design space of VR narratives will reveal opportunities to present richer and more explicit theoretical foundations. So we'll start with what we mean by a design space, especially in this context. So within design research, the design space is often understood as a metaphor. It's a conceptual space. And it represents both what is already available to us, so what's already been made, as well as what's possible. What are we hoping to propose through prototypes and proofs of concept? So in the case of our projects, for example, we're interested in the sensory and physical interactions in VR. So the first step is to ask, what are current examples of that in HCI? And how might we explore the contours of that possibility space through creation? So for design researchers, there's a lot to be learned from this kind of exploratory process. For people who apply this form of research through design, the goal is to use all of the facets of our design process to, quote, give dimensionality to the design space. So in other words, it's not just the end result, but all of the questions along the way. And those are all important to us. And I should note from the beginning that although we draw a lot on Bill Gaber's work, that doesn't really mean that our work resembles Bill Gaber's work. So to begin articulating how we did this, I'm very briefly going to talk about these 4 projects. And in each case, we're interested in questions about how we might better understand physical and sensory realities, especially when we're designing them for virtual reality narratives. And the result of each of our projects is that we create brief narrative experiences that give form to the kinds of questions that we want to ask. They give form to the kinds of decisions that we're making. So for the purpose of the presentation, I'm going to leave out the narratives just to be able to talk a little bit more about some of the general questions that come out of this kind of work. Because the design space is both a combination of what's available now, as well as a discovery of the possibility space. This is an important underlying question that I'd like us to keep in mind. What are the conceptual boundaries of the design spaces we hope to understand? In other words, what do we include or exclude as we identify and create possible design spaces? In each project, you'll see that we are thinking about our work in relation to a particular status quo, and we're asking how might we identify what is typical in this design space, and what are some of the alternative possibilities that may be under-examined. So in this first project, we were interested in this idea of diegetic, tangible objects in virtual reality narratives. Status quo at the time seemed to be a push towards more generalizable interaction that's possible with a controller. So without dismissing that, we're asking what's lost when the physicality of our tangible experience in VR is mediated by controllers. So for example, with this project, we're asking how might we incorporate some of the specific sensory qualities of physical objects? How might we turn our attention to the tactile realities of VR narratives? We continue that line of thinking in the next project, which we call Sensory VR, Smelling, Touching, and Eating Virtual Reality. Here we're responding to what seemed to be a push towards an increasingly mediated experience, especially within sensory experiences designed for the HCI community. So to have a sensory experience in VR, you have to put on all of this extra gear. And we asked, rather than be mediated upon by designers, why don't we use low-cost materials and a process of co-creation that gives people a chance to participate in the creation of a sensory experience? Next project was called Mobile Realities, designing for the medium of smartphone VR. At the time, we were seeing that smartphone-based virtual reality was considered the worst kind of virtual reality. On the one hand, it was talked about as a more accessible version of virtual reality, but it was always also talked about as the worst version of virtual reality. And we suggested that rather than think of it as low-quality virtual reality, why don't we think about the power of the smartphone to tell a story that moves from smartphones to VR, to outdoor space, leveraging 2 decades of mobile digital storytelling. So what new considerations arise when we make VR a truly mobile experience? And finally, this fourth project is called Playing by Ear, designing for the physical and a sound-based narrative. Here we were thinking about conceptualizations of VR design that begin their design process by imagining that we want a full digital simulation. And we asked, what happens if you begin with the physical qualities of the experience? Rather than begin with a digital experience that tries to align ourselves with the possibility of the simulation or the possibility of the technology, what happens when you begin with the physical reality? Physical reality of the environment, physical reality of our bodies, to situate where that interaction may take place. So throughout these projects, we're beginning to map out different facets of a possible design space for virtual reality narratives. We're consistently asking questions about what directions the HCI community seems to be taking, and as they chart their own trajectory for physical and sensory experiences, we're essentially saying, slow down, take a moment. What are we leaving behind? Who are we leaving behind? For us, extending these existing design spaces is also a process to articulate questions of responsibility. In our work, for example, we keep returning to questions about what it means when we bring our physical bodies and physical environments into virtual worlds. What kinds of sensory and physical realities are we trying to give space to in our design? Because even as our design work begins to push the possible design space of virtual reality, it's important to continue asking what the conceptual boundaries are of the design spaces that we create before we even begin. Our focus has been on sensory and physical interactions, but even as we ask members of our community to look beyond the boundary lines that they may have drawn, we're also asking the community to reflect on where we draw those boundary lines and why. What do we choose to include or exclude within that possible design space? Within the context of virtual reality, researchers like Carter and Eggleston, for example, continue to identify ethical implications of mixed reality technologies, particularly related to privacy and expanding forms of data collection. So we can ask to what degree are we actually considering these dimensions within our speculative design spaces? Or you could look to examples like this one, which is a report looking at how the worst of online culture also exists in online VR spaces, now with the added threat of physical interaction. So again, where are we placing the boundaries, the conceptual boundaries of our design spaces before we even begin our design? And to a degree, how we draw our design boundaries will be affected by our approach. And I would suggest that for each of these classic approaches to challenging the status quo within design, there are opportunities to be even more careful about how we enter into it and how we define our theoretical approach. So for example, in 2013, Bardzell and Bardzell, in a paper called What is Critical About Critical Design, they referred to articulations of critical and speculative design as, quote, so eccentric and narrow that they, quote, inadvertently mystify critical design. And that's obviously not what we want. We want this kind of work to have rich theoretical and practical considerations that we can take from one project to the next. In some senses, this reflects a larger turn within HCI, especially in the last decade, towards incorporating and interpreting theoretical considerations that were developed in other fields. So value-sensitive design, feminist HCI, queer HCI, intersectionality in HCI, critical race theory in HCI, so feminist HCI starting around 2010, critical race theory in HCI being a paper from 2020. And this is important work, and it points to new opportunities to highlight how these kinds of theoretical foundations might be applied to address the specific challenges and specific ethical dilemmas of a technology like VR. And I suggested at the beginning that we need richer and more explicit theoretical foundations to tackle these challenges. And that's partly because, as a community, we need to improve how we use this kind of theory. For example, in a study that looked at citational practices for feminist HCI over the last 10 years, these authors called the adoption mostly one-dimensional. We're mostly crediting the work, but not really engaging in its deeper implications. They write, Bardzell's proposed framework of contribution criteria, and feminist interaction qualities, were rarely used, showing potential for improvement of conceptual precision in future research and design outcomes. And we could say the same thing for intersectionality in HCI, which was introduced more recently to the community. So in this paper, the authors write that our current approaches are somewhat misguided, in quotes. And they're being kind here with their use of the word somewhat, given their larger argument that HCI needs to do better to acknowledge Black feminist contributions to intersectionality, that we have to be able to interrogate the power structures that are inherent in HCI, and that if we want to change design, how we design, we also have to be very cognizant of the kinds of research design communities we create. We have to be cognizant of the research design teams that we're fostering. And of course, this points to a larger issue in HCI, because if HCI and design communities continue to rely exclusively on these kinds of translational efforts for their theory, we risk minimizing the reach and scope of the design spaces that we hope to create. And this is, I would like to suggest, an important call to action for DR researchers in the field of HCI. How might we use this kind of translational work as a starting point to engage more deeply in the past and present forms of these theories? I want to conclude this brief talk by returning to this metaphor of the design space as a prompt for future work. As I've said, this is a metaphor, and it's important for us as designers to think of it that way. Because design work, we found that it's an opportunity to keep reminding ourselves that it's not a concrete space. We're participating in the creation of a conceptual space, and that raises important questions for us. If, for example, as Bill Gaber says, designed objects occupy and create, quote, space around themselves, an important question for us is, what spaces do we want to create? So I'll leave it there for today. Here's some contact information. Feel free to reach out to me. There's always more narratives that I want to create, more narratives I want to work on, so feel free to reach out. Ask them to brief.
That we can see over here too.
Yeah.
Okay.
She's a two-computer woman.
Well, I was like, you had fancy notes on yours, no fancy notes on mine. That's okay. Okay. We can see it? Excellent. Okay. So Dana just gave us a really nice set of kind of conceptual questions and ideas for critical interventions about how we might think differently about design. And my presentation today is actually offering an example of what one of those more practical interventions might look like explicitly from an intersectional feminist perspective. So today I'm thinking about what does it mean to move from online spaces to like IRL in real life spaces, thinking about how Feminist Think Tank, which I'll describe more in a minute, moved from our online space to actually do more community-based work. So, great. Today, as you'll see, like throughout this talk, my work and the work of Feminist Think Tank is bringing this overarching commitment to studying, amplifying, and creating activist media interventions within this digital moment. So Feminist Think Tank is a research creation collective. We're here at the GI at the University of Waterloo, and Dr. Shannon McDonald and I in Communication Arts co-direct Feminist Think Tank. And so across all of my own work, my research program is really trying to explore how people are using media in critical but also creative ways to try to foster community and also speak back to power. And so I'm looking at how people are trying to build community through digital technologies while also negotiating those really complex power dimensions that are inherent to those digital spaces. So today I'm going to give you just an introduction of my ongoing feminist research creation Instagram project with Shannon that's exploring that specific question. And then I'm going to talk about our community work with the Coalition of Muslim Women here in KW. So I'm going to start by offering really like the context for the project. And I wish we had lots of time because there's so much to go into, but I'm going to give you just a little taste of what we're doing here. So after that, I'll discuss our methods as well as how we understand the project as really a methodological, oh my, is that?
Sorry, no, that's me.
I was like, is my calculator coming in?
No,
Okay.
that's me.
And then So I'm going to think about like our methods and how we see it really as a methodological intervention into the study of social media research as it stands right now. And then I'll talk about our project design, and then I will close out by touching on how this work has branched out into other projects, mainly focusing on our work with the Coalition of Muslim Women, and then I can talk about other projects later if you'd like. But thinking about how these connections are really key for forming solidarities between our various communities. And so then throughout that talk, I'll really try to point us towards how the work of Feminist Think Tank and my own work is trying to study, amplify, and create these activist media interventions through a critical feminist design praxis so that we can think about how we bridge the gap between academic scholarship and public conversations that are happening. So we'll get started with a little bit of background here. So for those of you who don't know, Shannon McDonald and I co-direct the Feminist Think Tank. And Feminist Think Tank, or FTT, is a research collective that advances research on art, media, and design from a data feminist perspective. We've got some lovely Feminist Think Tank members in the audience here today, so happy to see you here. But really, we are committed to intervening into things like white supremacy, misogyny, and queer and transphobia. And those are really key to our work. And through those interventions, we really try to aim to provide students with opportunities to advance their own knowledge through participating in different events. And so that might be critical reading groups. We've done brainstorming sessions for students' own projects. We review research together. We participate in data jams. And then we offer research creation activities. And I'll show you some of those research creation examples later on. So like all the posts that you see on the screen here are actually examples of how people from FTT have been doing that research creation process. So in the beginning of 2019, Shanna and I created this knowledge mobilization Instagram account. And so here you see a few screenshots of some of the collective work that FTT has been doing over the last, what, 3 years? How many years has it been since 2019? 3? Great, okay. So we really wanted to connect with millennials and Gen Z digital feminists and try to offer an archive of existing media tactics for conversation and for amplification. So at the beginning of the project in 2019, we were comparing the different ways that the idea of the personal as political has been taken up by feminist media makers, specifically in North America. And we're thinking about that between two distinct eras. So we were thinking about it between 1960 to 1980, and then from 2000 to 2020. And that's because we're seeing some really interesting tactics being remediated from the 60s to the 80s today in this digital moment. And so really the project is arguing that there are important links between those two historical moments. Both eras are using the personal is political as really a groundwork for politics and for art. And so in the 60s and 70s, the personal is political was really promoting consciousness raising groups and a lot of public protest. And that was creating a really important platform for speaking out against the marginalization of women in dominant culture. Now, though, we're noticing, despite all those efforts, Instagram is like magnifying a really interesting range of images, including both activist and problematic, like neoliberal, ableist versions of feminism, despite the fact that there was like so much work happening by racialized, queer, and disabled feminists, and it's not really being taken into account on Instagram, of course, in the current moment, or in media at large. So we created our Instagram account, Aesthetic Resistance, to speak back to the power of Instagram's algorithm. So for example, when you search feminism on Instagram, these are the series of posts that will come up right now. So I took these shots like 3 or 4 days ago. So these are really recent. And like in the middle screenshot, middle row, middle post there, it might like look like we have a really nice post, but the text on the post asks, why are our daughters becoming feminists? And if you click on the post, it's this kind of parents lamenting the fact that their daughters are becoming feminists. Or here you've got Emma Watson, and she's like, there's no criteria for feminism. But like, isn't there a criteria, right? Bell Hooks says that feminism is for everybody, but the criteria is that it's like a movement to end sexist oppression. It's not just about living contently, it's not just about being joyful, like that post there says. And so aesthetic resistance becomes this place for us to dwell with feminist media that are representing to us forms of activism from the 1960s to the present, And really it's a way for us to chart how previous tactics are being remediated today. So we see the account as a form of research creation practice where the doing or the making of the account is part of the research process. So overall, we see the account as functioning as three main things. So first, it is a design intervention into prevailing Instagram culture that is trying to amplify voices that have been marginalized by white supremacy, by colonialism, and by heteropatriarchy. It's also a digital database of feminist, historical, and contemporary media practices and activist moments. And then third, it's an online space for discussion about these topics. And that discussion is prompted by our own kind of interventions and our own investments in the posts that we're talking about for that day. So the account is trying to offer a tactical guide for media-based resistance in the face of things like post-feminism and neoliberalism. So we're trying to archive and then amplify online artists and then engage with diverse representation and show how vital our own personal engagement is with the work. So then to do the work, we're trying to foreground feminist methods that are focusing on what Sarah Sharma has called digital social justice, both on what we study and how we're studying it. So like I said, we're taking our cue from Sarah Sharma's 2021 argument that is saying that the work of feminist media studies is to locate the medium-specific technologics of how power operates in culture. So to do that, we try to rely on embodied methods of dwelling to highlight the specificities of the space that are really often overwritten by more dominant perceptions and uses of it. And so as I discussed in this recent SAGE chapter in doing research online, embodiment is really important because it's enhancing our connection to ourselves, to our communities, and to our research, and then also to the world around us at large. And so to make meaning from embodied experiences really asks that we become as self-aware as possible of our body, of our social locations, of our experiences, and our reactions to and within the combined digital and physical environments that we're finding ourselves enmeshed with. And that's really like messy work. And that messiness is in part why we value research creation as a process of design and research. So as Shanna and I talk about with the other QLab folks in our 2020 article for Methods for Digital Feminist Humanities, we're drawn to practices of research creation where creation is really required for research to emerge. And so for us, this involves this kind of gathering of things and then revealing through creation. So that way we can actually try to find or extract knowledge from the process of doing rather than assume we're going to find something at the end or that we know something at the beginning. And so here is like an example of some of the gathering and revealing of work that we as feminist think tank have done. And so for us, it's really in the doing and the making process that the hidden and more tacit knowledges of the research project are able to emerge. And so here we're really privy to the multiple parts and bodies and events and contexts and objects and images, all of these things that make up the research scene. And so then taking process, production, and materiality together is helping us to think about the really important political, social, and technological networks in the mediated spaces that are always already opening and closing possibilities for discussion based on algorithms that we are told are neutral and that we know are, of course, not neutral. And so this speaks really to the design of the project. So like many of us know here, feminists across science and technology studies, game studies, media studies, HCI, we know all too well that our current technologies and our digital cultures are just overflowing with forms of mediated misogyny that are promoting intimidation, harassment, and like Brené Weiser and Miltner say, alarming amounts of vitriol and violence in online spaces. So that means that through Instagram, we're working instead to amplify marginalized voices that might be affected by what Safiya Noble calls algorithms of oppression. So we try to articulate what these networks are, collaborating on ideas for posts and how to challenge these problematics, and then thinking through different interventions. And so because of this, we take very seriously the key claims of the hashtag TransformDH manifesto to think through how we can work through the process. And so first, based on that manifesto, we take very seriously that questions of race, class, gender, sexuality, and disability should be central to digital humanities and to digital media studies. Second, we assert that feminist, queer, and anti-racist activists, artists, and media makers outside of academia are doing work that contributes to digital studies in all of its forms already. And that work is really important because it's already destabilizing the norms and the standards of institutionally recognized academic work. And then third, we believe that we should be shifting the focus of digital humanities from solely technical processes to more political processes. And what that means is that we always have to try to understand the social, the intellectual, the economic, political, and personal impact of our digital practices as we are developing them. And so then given this context, we recognize the affordances of Instagram and the culture of production that circulates around it, and then we try to repurpose or queer those tools for other means. And so we don't buy into influencer culture. We don't try to just produce endlessly because we're supposed to, and we try to question the circulation and the promotion of particular feelings, ideologies, and politics on the platform. So really, and this is actually our first post from the account like ever, really the project was designed with the intent of co-opting the functions of what Audre Lorde so actively engaging in community building is at its core one of the really key components of the project. You know, we think like, why seek out, why explore and document feminist media tactics other than to push for better, more just, more sustainable feminist futures? So now I'll very briefly share a project that has emerged from this Instagram work of developing critical praxes for feminist online communities. So one key community project that has really materialized from the exploration of online feminist spaces is a collaboration with, and one of their main concerns has been the rise of Islamophobia and online hate. Obviously, online hate has been rising and it's a pressing issue. And it's an especially pressing issue for CMW and among their youth, because in recent years, there's been the rise of the internet, the rise of social media platforms. And so then marginalized and racialized populations are really among the first to be targeted, and Muslim youth are among the most vulnerable populations as targets of Islamophobia. And so CMW obviously was noting this, and then they reached out to Shanna and I at Feminist Think Tank to develop a set of workshops around gendered and racialized online hate based on our Instagram research. So the Coalition of Muslim Women asked us to do these workshops, and I'll tell you just like really briefly 3 of the things that we try to do in those workshops. So first, we try to do digital literacy training, including a discussion of the information media crisis, platform affordances, and then we point towards media ecologies and disinformation, and the way that disinformation really thrives in our media ecologies. Then we talk about really what online hate is rooted in. So we look towards mediated misogyny, white supremacy, and gender Islamophobia for that. And then last, we bring these concepts together so that we can create and then circulate individual social media campaigns and counter tactics to online hate. And this is what the Coalition of Muslim Women has called counter speech. So counter speech is this tactic of countering online hate speech or misinformation by presenting an alternative narrative rather than just actually default to censoring the offending speech. And so here you'll actually see a few images from our workshops. So you can see some of the platform affordance brainstorming that we do. But rather than censoring, offering different narratives is important, because then the person who is the target of misinformation or violence doesn't become further targeted by just pushing back. And so we're seeing counter speech as a really key tactic in our digital feminist toolkits, because it tackles online Islamophobic expressions of hate by drawing on de-radicalization and then peaceful resolution of conflict through narrative rather than direct conflict. And so the goal is not necessarily to like directly address the person or social media bot who is guilty of Islamophobia, but instead we're trying to flood news feeds with more positive representations of Islam and Muslim people. And so then counter speech, they've said, has really had a considerable impact on the community because it's dissuading online audiences from wanting to contribute to the spread of vitriol. And it's galvanizing more acts of counter speech. So when they see one act of counter speech, others who are not necessarily connected to CMW actually pile on and add more, more of their own experiences to help the person who is being attacked. And so really overall, to wrap it all up, the project is returning to my framework and to Feminist Think Tank's framework of studying, amplifying, and creating with particular attention to the circulation of power, to think about how people can actually use media within this like mediascape that is overridden with online violence and disinformation and misinformation. Within that context, how do we actually use media to fight back in critical and creative ways? How can we foster community? And so this project is one example of how we see that happening. And it's really helpful and nice in a way because it helps us think about how we actually can create these small scale changes and connections within our community to fight for, you know, better futures. And that might sound cheesy, but really like why do this work other than that? So I'll wrap it up there and say thank you all. All right.
Thank you so much, Bree and Daniel. Daniel, if you want to come and join Bree here, and we'll take questions from the in-person and online audience. If you're in the online audience, you can feel free to type your question in the chat, and I can read it out for you. Or you can say that you have a question. I can call on you, and you can unmute yourself. But maybe just while that's getting going, is there anyone in person who'd like to start us off? Yeah.
I have a question for Daniel.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, within your research, one of the common concerns in VR is like motion sickness or kind of that like your body not being fully immersed and therefore being confused. Do you find that the research that you're doing kind of helps address that kind of concern?
So I'm glad that you asked that. We have the author of one of the paper that actually talks about that a lot. That's another important concern that we should be thinking about with this kind of design space, right? It's part of what we're thinking about when we're using a problematic technology, essentially a broken technology. It makes people sick when they use it. And so Kayla MacArthur, in her work, she looks at cyber sickness and thinking through like how we even measure that, accept that, bring that into the conversation so that we're actually addressing it as part of it. So I would say that the work that I'm doing, these narrative projects, they're so short, these stories that we're telling with narratives, that it actually never got to a stage where people were sick. It was something that we were thinking about throughout the design process, and it was something that we were thinking about through our ethics protocols. But basically, it was at the time a strategy of using best practices available to us and seeing how we can work around those challenges. But it's absolutely one of those facets of the design space, right? And it's, I think, in line with the kinds of things that I was suggesting, is you have to be thinking about it. It has to be a consideration. And in Kaylee's paper, it's also saying when we're looking at the measures, like how we're assessing things like cyber sickness, we have to be thinking about things like gender. We have to be thinking about things like broader demographic characteristics. Because if we're not thinking about that, then all of our assessments are off. Thank you.
It could be also discussion based too if people don't have questions, but comments or anything for follow-up. Yay,
So I have a bit of a question, especially for Bree. So a lot of the problems with social media right now, especially because it's so algorithm-based, is the algorithm is unfortunately really designed to hone in on a lot of the problematic stuff of just like it amplifies the hate and it amplifies these discourses and makes it completely blown out of proportion, especially for something like Twitter. So it's like, and when you're trying to conceptualize a lot of these designs, do you ever come to a point where you're just like, this whole entire system needs to be burned down at that point? Because that's sometimes how I feel about it, where it's just like, there's like this system is completely rotten to the core, so it's like, why not just look for something else?
So this is a great question, and I think we're actually seeing a really good example of that right now. Like you would know, like you're also an expert in this on Twitter, right? With people being like screw Elon Musk. Sorry, I almost said a bad word there. Screw Elon Musk. We have to move somewhere else. And at the same time, it's like deeply saddening because so many communities were built on these social media platforms where there was no space IRL for them to actually come together, especially when you're in different global locations where there's no space for you to actually have a voice because you're constantly being silenced. And so while we're like obviously disheartened and frequently we're like, oh, why is this happening? We know why it's happening, and it's not just online spaces that are so deeply fraught. It's our offline spaces as well. Like all of our institutions, governments have the same kinds of structural problems, and it would be wonderful if we could burn them all down and start over. But part of the kind of hopeful thread that we hold on to is that there must be space for something new, because we've seen the kinds of community building that did happen on Twitter, despite the like fire dumpster of like hot garbage that it has always been. We saw Black feminists mobilizing online. We saw, while we saw Gamergate, we also saw responses to Gamergate, and Emma knows that really well as well. Like there are all of these kinds of responses to the hate that we see, and I think that that's what makes social media a place that still is deserving of research and attention, because there are still these spaces of hope despite the kind of fraught tensions and disinformation that happens there. I don't know. Do you follow up with that?
A little bit, because I'm like,
yeah.
there is something comparable there, because there's the whole, so there is, say, Twitter, which is, garbage right now, but it's still trying to maintain some semblance of moderation and control over these very dark topics, especially when, have a lot of hate speech going on, versus, a site like Parler, which is like anti-Twitter, which is where, Donald Trump has gone, which is where a lot of fascists have gone, because there is no moderation there. But the problem with that is you can't advertise a site like that, because mainstream advertisers won't go to a site like Parler, and mainstream advertisers have already, limited their spending or frozen their spending for advertisements on Twitter because of, the Elon Musk buyout. So there is certainly some way that can be done as being like, it is technically money driven, and being like, okay, it's, which is, unfortunate, as much as I don't want to think it's like, dependent on where the money is. But if you're seeing these mainstream advertisers be like, hey, this is a bit too much even for us, then it's like, you kind of know something's there-ish, I guess.
Yeah, sorry, can you?
Yeah, so sorry, it's really confusing, just because it's like, if trying to like maintain a site is because they already have some of the communities that are on there, of just being like, either thinking, where can we go except for these major sites which have like really ingrained themselves. So it's like, it's kind of like a hard thing to think about in terms of like, where do people go next, or like, how do we kind of control this, or should we be controlling it, or should we just let the sites fall because they're, digging yourselves into a pit because they're just burning through money at this point, because they've suddenly become unmonetizable because of how much hate speech is on their site.
Well, this is a really interesting point. Like, I don't think that it is a coincidence that Elon Musk chose this particular moment to buy Twitter out. Right, at the moment where we're seeing these increase in social media activism, we're seeing people galvanizing online. We're seeing people talk about what it might look like to bring down billionaires. And Musk is like, uh-oh, I don't want to deal with that. We can't deal with that. So what am I going to do? I'm going to buy out Twitter. I don't know if that was his act of thought, but I don't think it's a coincidence that these things overlap. With the increase of social media protests, there's always a pushback. Like, we used to see, like, I think 10 years of like good protest and like feminism on the uprise. Now it's like, for example, with the Me Too movement, which is really where my research is in, it's been 5 years. This October was exactly 5 years since Me Too went viral on social media. And in this October, there were a bunch of articles that came out from like the New York Times, The Guardian, New Yorker, saying, despite this reckoning we had, there's been what feels like a massive regression in our kind of progressive movements forward. And so I don't know what that will look like in the future, but I also think that it's really important to like notice how long things stay trendy for and what it means to be trendy in that time. feminism became popular, but not a kind of feminism we wanted to actually buy into. We don't want this post-feminism, like neoliberal, like white crap, right? We want intersectional feminism. That hasn't come into mainstream media yet. With Me Too, we were like, yes, okay, we're making movements, we're seeing that this is happening. And despite their like using to be about 10 years, now we've got a shorter time frame. We've got only 5 years now of like movement, and suddenly we're regressing. So I think mapping those tensions, mapping those timelines, and mapping the social media movements is really important to get exactly to what your point is. What do we do with that? How do we make movement? I think right now it's to watch and observe and see what we can do with like the tools that are there, and how do we kind of intervene in those tools and use them for purposes different than they were meant to be used for. And like, you know, that's what feminist media is doing. We don't really care about reach. We don't really care about how many people come to our site. I think you made that really awesome meme that was like, our few followers, here's the information we give you. And it was a great meme because it was so accurate and also kept the community alive there. Yeah.
That last point you just made relates a bit to Leonard's question in the chat about your thoughts on studying the social algorithms and co-opting algorithmic preferences to increase the reach.
I don't care about the reach. I know I should. I don't care, you know?
But then you're using the wrong platform, right? Like the whole point is the megaphone, right? Like social media is a megaphone. If you're specifically breaking the megaphone and putting it down, why use the megaphone in the first place?
Because
right?
it's to bring attention to the fact that the social media platform is inherently flawed from the start, and to say that there's still ways to create community. So we've got like 600 followers right now. That's not tons, but it's a lot. And also what's been important about Instagram is like that's actually how one of my students reached out to me to be like, hey, I was in your class once, I see you have this Instagram account, and I'm part of CMW, would you ever want to connect? And I hadn't realized at that point that they had also reached out to Shanna, so we actually been approached differently from different people. And I'm like, that one connection was really important, and like actually is what led to the community building work.
That's what I mean. If you used it, if you co-opted the patterns that make you grow on these platforms and you used it to your advantage, you'd have way more of these random connections.
Maybe,
and so it would further your research even more,
no? Quality versus quantity?
Yeah, like I think that like more, and I also don't know how, like I'm not tracking who is coming onto the platform. I also, I'm not invested in actually investing the time to crack open more, like for more. I'm like invested in maintaining these kinds of smaller community kind of connections we've been able to make. If we get more followers, that's great, but really it's about like what is our team able to do and then create, and how are we creating just basically a database of like tactics.
So my comment to that is then, and this might just be a fundamental different understanding of how social media works, right? Because for me, social media is, or like how many creators use social media, it's a funnel, right? It's basically like you're going fishing in the sea, you're catching all the fish, and then you're funneling them into a community on Discord, on Slack, on your newsletter, wherever you want to have that community. So you're funneling them into that. But when you're out on the fishing expedition, it's all about weaving the net wide. And it seems like you just want to go on the fishing expedition with a small net, and you're satisfied with that. And you're okay with letting all these other fish just swim around.
Maybe you're more like a siren, you know? You're singing your call.
No, but I love that you called us a siren, because like Shanna and I are writing about the nymphs right now. And what are the nymphs doing? And so like, yeah, I'd rather be a siren and people can come than like come all in. So I hear what you're saying, like there are opportunities there, but also the fear of getting too big is like, we know that there is so much violence online. When you start to become more well-known, you open yourself up and your team up to the kinds of violences that happen to marginalized people in online spaces. So for us, it really is about like, yeah, the siren call, I love that metaphor.
Sorry, I'm going to be all English major on you. Also, Ali said that.
Oh, sorry.
For a long
Oh, that's
time.
fine. I had a question and then I had a few comments because I'm probably the person who's on the side of technology here. My first question was, do you think of yourself as actually a siren call? Yeah.
Me? Oh, sorry.
one of the things we were discussing actually just now was about gatekeeping and distributed gatekeeping in online communities. And so one of the things we've started seeing is that we've gone from the traditional model of one gatekeeper to multiple gatekeepers within online communities. And getting access to an online community is getting more complicated. Do you see yourself in that role of being like a gatekeeper rather than a siren call? Like or is anyone just welcome to join your communities if they so choose to?
So in terms of like gatekeeping and seeing more gatekeeping, can you give me a specific example of what you're thinking of there?
Somebody wants to join the community. Would you let them out? Would you not let them join if, for example, they have views that could be considered offensive?
Probably. So we would have a conversation, right? If you're gonna, so we're open to everybody, but I'm not here to also put the members of my team at risk. We all inhabit different marginalized social locations. And if somebody is here to play devil's advocate or try to change our position, like that's not quite where we want to be. But if they actually do want to come and have a conversation with us, we'd be like, absolutely, come hang out with us. The more the merrier, we want to talk. But if it is with the intent of, violence, I'm actually like, yeah, I'm not here to create a space where the people who are already in my team feel unsafe.
Have you been in a situation like that where you've had to gatekeep or where you've had to,
So not with Feminist Think Tank. It happens in classes sometimes. So you have to actually, talk to people who are like, well, I took this class that's called Digital Feminist Futures, but I don't care about feminism. And you say, okay, well, welcome. We're about to have 12 weeks of feminist fun. Like you can be here or you cannot be here, but what do you want to do? Yeah.
I just have a question for Daniel, or I don't know if you have a.
Oh, I was just going to make a comment about tech, but please go ahead with your question.
Okay, just because I want to ask something for Daniel, and then I guess we can also, in person, continue the conversation after. I'm really interested in some of the stuff that you were talking about the sort of evolution, I guess, of HCI research. I'm really interested in interdisciplinarity, but also disciplinarity. And how fields and subfields form and that sort of thing. And I think that learning more about HCI, working here, it's interesting because it's, there's this conversation about how like, oh, these different perspectives are being added to HCI research and HCI design research, but intersectional design, feminist design, critical design, like it's existed for so long already, like it's so old. And I think that I'm very familiar with the ways that game studies, for example, is this very, very small subfield of a small subfield that acts like it's like the whole world and that it's the most important thing in the world. And so I guess this is like, in your opinion, how does this sort of happen where these where fields can get sort of maybe isolated or insular where there's just so much intersectional design research already exists for 50, 100 years or whatever, but it's only happening now, I guess. Does that make sense as a question? It's a very broad question.
I think I can start tackling
yeah, we can talk more about it later. But
yeah, I mean, it's also useful to think of HCI as not being a monolith itself either,
yeah.
Right? And so even within the design community, there's also splintered factions of where people sort of align themselves and that kind of thing. Even within the term research through design, there's two big camps that people sort of go down. One sort of the arts-based camp, the other sort of a science-based camp. And each sort of thinking about what kinds of contributions they make, and each thinking about how they fit within this particular field of HCI. And so some people will sort of think of it as, especially people who are sort of leaning more towards these critical orientations and leaning towards interpreting and translating those critical orientations for HCI. They're thinking about it as being a necessary step, right? We're thinking about the human part in human-computer interaction. What does it mean when we sort of think about that? And expanding it beyond the individual, bringing it back to the society, bringing it back to culture, and thinking about the specificities of where our design takes place. So those kinds of questions are, I think, at the heart of some of that breaking apart that is happening right now within HCI and has been happening for the last, let's say, 20 years. So value-sensitive design, for example, is 96. They was first introduced, and I mean, even then you can sort of trace back further and further. And I think the larger issue here for me is that we need that translational work, but we also have to go back to the sources of where that work originated. And we have to be able to think about what the actual foundations of some of that work were, and why it came about. What kinds of questions were they asking society?
So it almost it has to be inherently interdisciplinary.
Has to be.
Then,
Yeah.
yeah. That's interesting.
And that speaks to our design teams as well, right? Like if we have an insular design team that thinks in one way, we're going to limit ourselves.
Yeah. We probably have, time for one more question, if there's anyone other than Ali, but then if not, we'll go back to Ali.
Maybe online.
Maybe online there's somebody on it.
No one online. So yeah, go for it.
Taking the side of tech. Okay. Tech tends to amplify what you do, right? So the algorithms aren't created to amplify something globally. Twitter's algorithms, Facebook algorithms, no matter how much they're studied, say the same thing. Two different people will amplify what you're looking at. If you're getting enraged by something and you're engaging with it, it's amplifying that engagement. A product manager who's on Twitter, their goal is to increase engagement, increase conversion of ads. How do they increase conversion of ads? By keeping you on the platform longer. And a lot of time, we will make tech the bogeyman and take away the agency of the humans using it. If we are going in to use tech, and this is just a comment, if you're going in to use tech and we're saying, hey, I definitely want to see this and get mad at it, and I'm constantly going down that path, you're being fed more of the same thing. Which is why now you have these buckets of, Republican Facebook, Democrat Facebook, and people don't really look outside their bubble. The reason I wanted to make that counterpoint was because Twitter inherently isn't hate-filled. Facebook inherently isn't hate-filled. It gets amplified because the people who are reading it, and then we read about it from people who are reading it. Like, if you ask me, I look at Twitter and I'm like, what I'm reading about Twitter is like, oh my God, this is a cluster beep, right? And Elon has destroyed it. At the same time, when I talk to members of the Kai community, they continue to use, because that's one of the communities we know very well, they continue to use Twitter as a means to collaborate, and even today find new connections, where they don't see that hate being amplified. They see those connections being amplified. At the end of the day, while there is a commercial aspect to all of this, Twitter has turned a profit once in its entire history. Literally just 1 year were they in the green. They've been in the red the whole time. They'll continue to remain in the red. And the final piece, which I completely disagree on, was I think Elon Musk didn't want to buy Twitter. That's my view. He tried to get out of it, and the only reason he ended up buying it was because he was forced to, and he knows it's a bad decision to buy a $27 billion company for 44. I don't think anyone's going in to break down movements.
So I think you're actually, okay, a few points.
Yeah, for sure.
We know absolutely from folks like Wendy Chun, from people like Ruha Benjamin, Safiya Noble, that the internet and technology is created to polarize, like you said. They absolutely want to create polarization. And through doing that, they are really lending to the circulation of dis and misinformation. Absolutely know that. Through that, it's not, we do know that. So, okay, that's fine. We'll disagree on that. I'll take the side of like Wendy Chan, Ruha Benjamin, and Safiya Noble. So when that's happening, it's not just that we have to give human users or participants who are participating on social media as agency. We also have to think about the agency that is often ignored for the people who are making algorithms. So we know algorithms are created with the biases of their creators inherently baked into that technology, and then that's what's getting amplified. So it's not just that it's what you, as a participant on social media, are kind of flipping through. It's also like what kinds of biases were already baked into that technology before you as a user actually got to it. And how is that affecting the ways that certain messages can or can't actually be circulated in online messaging?
The other aspect of this is probably also important to think about is that like these kinds of critiques that Bri and I might make about technology aren't anti-technology. Right? We're both using technology.
No, I'm going to be on social media until it like is no longer. I love social media.
And so the question becomes, how do we make these spaces better, right? And how do we, honestly recognize the fact that it does do that kind of polarization? How do we honestly recognize the fact that it might push people towards hate or amplify hate better than it amplifies the opposite, right? And how can we recognize the opportunities to change those kinds of things from the inside, right? From the beginning, with the algorithm, with the structure of the company. And so all those sort of different facets become part of the kind of thing we're trying to turn our attention to.
I also just wanted to point out, I think it's interesting you mentioned like the Chi groups, or like Twitter has different areas that are not polarizing inherently. Like academia, in a group that has a lot of research that's similar, is going to be very different from a community that's like looking for a safe haven to talk to women who sometimes you just need people who are like-minded and you want to have a conversation, but those marginalized communities are a lot more at risk to become polarizing, or to have hate and violence like targeted towards them. So I think it's not really comparing apples to apples when you say like, let's talk about like product manager Twitter or Chi Twitter, where it's very vanilla and very like safe, whereas like a lot of the times when people are looking for safe spaces, they get like flooded and inundated with people trying to make it unsafe for them. And you see that in person as well. That's not just online, but online it's you see it just 10 times worse or whatever, because people are anonymized or whatever, and there's more access to these spaces. So I think that's something to distinguish for future, is that some spaces are inherently more targeted to polarization.
That's a really good point. Yeah. I didn't think of it that way at all. I was thinking of the algorithms, not the actual polarization and the moderation point that comes in with people targeting you, right? So for me, it's what the algorithm doing, not what the people on it were doing.
I think it's a both and though. Like the points you bring up are really good because it reminds us that we need to think more holistically and not just about one or two facets. What are the ways that we actually get to bring these different ideas together and then better explore like what a better future could look like that way?
I feel like that is a good note to end on. So thank you so much for everyone for joining us, both online and in person. And if everyone can just join me in giving Bree and Daniel a round of applause.